Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Vijay Sipera, your chairperson for this session, and it's such a pleasure and a privilege to be in a position to introduce Professor Colin Binns from Australia, uh, who is our speaker for the next 20 to 30 minutes. After 8 years of medical work in Papua New Guinea, he joined the Curtin University of Perth, Australia in 1977 and became foundation head of the School of Public Health. His publications include 600 papers, 50 books and chapters on public health, and he has also contributed dietary guidelines and public health and nutrition. Professor Binns is editor in chief of the Asia Pacific Journal of Public Health and previously the Australian Journal of Health Promotion. His honors that he has secured have included the Research Australia Lifetime Achievement Award for translation of science into public policy and Senior Australian of the Year. So we have a world expert on nutrition to talk to us on his topic on nutrition for infants during emergency. Over to you, Professor Binns.
Oh, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for that very generous introduction. I am really sorry that I can't join you in person in Sri Lanka and appreciate some of that wonderful Sri Lankan food, but I'll just dream about it and maybe I can come again in the near future. Now, if you'll just bear with me for 1 minute, I'm going to bring up my PowerPoint. Sorry, somehow it all got out of sequence. We'll get there. There we are. Okay. This afternoon I'm going to speak about nutrition for infants during and after disasters. This is going to be a very quick talk. Normally we would give this over a period of, say, a week's intensive course on nutrition. But in this case, it'll be a very quick one. So hopefully this is it. At present time, at no point in human history have we faced so many risks from disasters of various kinds. We've got the natural disasters that are increasing in intensity. We've got COVID-19. We've got climate change. And disasters of today, regardless of their cause, often involve complicated economic dislocation, the collapse of political structures, and they may result in violence. And of course, famine and food shortages is always a problem. The number of refugees in the world has increased dramatically. Previously, statistics have been fairly wanting, but the UN statistics are that in the last 40 years, the number of refugees has increased to more than 70 million. And we know that up to 80% of the victims of disasters and displacement are women and children. Now, we have to classify disasters in order to understand the best ways of dealing with them. And the immediate effect of a disaster depends on the rate of onset, whether it's rapid, such as an earthquake, or whether it's a rather slower onset, such as a famine. Its location, whether it's located somewhere where relief can be organised quickly or in a very remote place. The time of occurrence can be important. For example, some years ago, there was a major earthquake in South America, and it happened to occur just during a World Cup football final. And so everyone was inside, and with their stone houses, the earthquake caused major collapse and hundreds of thousands of deaths and injuries. On the other hand, if it had occurred on a weekday and people had been outside tending their fields, then the damage would have been far less. So some of the trigger events for disasters are droughts and floods, epidemics and so on. You can see all of the events there that we are only too familiar with due to modern communications. When we look at the consequences of disasters, we've got the primary effects of deaths and injuries, which of course depend on the location and the type of disaster. And then we've got the secondary effects which occur in the short term and the long term. In the short term, we have water contamination and water shortages. We have a lack of shelter, we have a lack of food, and we have environmental damage. And then in the longer term, we have longer term problems from rebuilding, which may result in deforestation as trees are removed for building. We have population displacements, we have epidemics, and we always have psychological problems. Managing disasters. Well, the most important part of managing a disaster is before it occurs, to plan and to prevent. And then afterwards, as soon as the disaster's occurred, it's important to assess the extent of the damage, to record where things have happened, and then to manage. Now, I put record there as number 2 because in my experience, logistics are extremely important. In several emergencies that I was involved in Papua New Guinea, records were not well kept. We had very little knowledge of where supplies had been sent, and as a consequence, some areas ended up with too much in the way of supplies and staff, and other areas were depleted of resources. One of the things I always emphasize to my students and to others who we're discussing disasters with is to be very careful of your staff. There are many hazards, and all people who are to deal with disasters need training and they need supervision in the field to prevent them from becoming damaged. People get very enthusiastic wanting to help others, which is very natural, but then expose themselves to unnecessary risk. And there is nothing worse than an injured or ill health worker who is trying to help others. And some of the things that I've certainly come across, power lines that are down, and we've had several staff members over the years that have suffered from electric shocks, fire, injuries, etc. The priorities are obviously rescue and safety, and then the provision of water, shelter and food, and the more traditional interventions that we've listed here. So we must prepare, we must be managed, and we must develop the areas that have been affected to minimise the impact of future disasters. Now I'm going to talk about one of my passions, which is the feeding of infants. And of course, the basis of feeding of infants and good nutrition during infancy, during childhood, and in fact with residual benefits throughout life is breastfeeding. And the most important way of encouraging breastfeeding is to make sure that all mothers are provided with clean food, with clean water and enough food. And then the general population needs to be provided with basic energy and protein and other macronutrients. And we need micronutrients and so on. And all the way along, we need to keep records so that we can evaluate what had happened. A couple of things that it's important to remember in infant feeding in emergencies is that children like to eat familiar foods. They often will simply just refuse to eat any foods which they don't like the taste of, which they're unfamiliar with. For infants, breast is always best. And remember that hungry children cry, but really hungry children who are also severely ill just lie quietly, and they may be the ones who require your urgent attention. Infant formula only has a place where mothers have been separated from infants by illness, injury, or even death, and there are no alternatives available. I'm going to provide examples of 3 different case studies. The first was one that I was in the centre of in Papua New Guinea, where a famine developed after drought and some frosts which destroyed the local crops, the sweet potato. This was in a very remote area with slow onset. There was no international publicity because it's such a remote area and very little relief work. The one thing about Papua New Guinea is that there's a ban on the distribution of infant formula. In this case, the outcome was slow recovery, but there was very little increase over the baseline of infant and child mortality. And then I'll talk about briefly the Great Western China Earthquake in the Chengdu area, the home of the pandas, which resulted in a massive relief effort. Some 20,000 soldiers were deployed within 48 hours, and over the course of the next week, something like 8 to 10 million volunteers came into the area. The bad part about this earthquake was that there were so many donations of infant formula from multinational companies that the whole area was simply flooded with formula. And then I'll talk briefly about the Yogyakarta earthquake in Indonesia. This is where I worked for 8 years in Papua New Guinea in a very remote area of the highlands. This was the kind of terrain that we had to get over to get to my little hospital. That's the main Highlands Highway. It was often in that sort of condition. That's the bridge across the river, and my hospital was on the top of the hill to the left. This is what happens every 10 to 20 years in the highlands. There's a frost and a drought, and the sweet potato crops just simply shrivel up and die. At the time of the famine, I happened to be doing some nutrition surveys, and you can see that the intake of energy for young children was very low. It decreased during some of the period, but always remained low, which just shows how severe the shortage of food was. Here are some of the children that suffered during the famine. Little guy on the left here, of course, is very skinny and suffering from edema, so he's got kwashiorkor. The mother on the right herself is severely malnourished, and the child is malnourished. But mothers in this condition can still breastfeed sufficiently to provide nutrition for their mothers. And that child survived and the mother survived. Then I want to talk about the Great Western Earthquake in Sichuan. Its capital is Chengdu, and it's the home of the pandas. In May 2008, there was a very large earthquake. There were 69,000 people killed, and another 18,000 were missing. 5 million buildings and houses were destroyed. That's what it looked like. That's me with one of my PhD students. In the background is the village of Wenchuan, and you can see that the building was simply collapsed. The rescue effort was massive. There were 20,000 troops deployed almost immediately, which just shows the extent of planning and the good logistics in that country. As you can see, I've highlighted the sentence which says large quantities of infant formula were donated by infant formula companies for distribution throughout hospitals. 1 year after the earthquake, UNICEF estimated that assistance was reaching nearly 4,000 villages and towns, covering a population around about 5 million, and that 300,000 infants and young children were still receiving nutrition. 2 years later, we did a survey to find out what was happening. And this is what we discovered. The first feed of infants, which is very important in establishing exclusive breastfeeding. Well, you can see the figures. In Jeonju, it was only 7% of babies were given breast milk. In Chengdu, it was 21%. Why did this happen? Well, there was so much infant formula donated, with companies flying in supplies with their banners and their advertising, that the hospital storerooms simply filled up with infant formula. And the staff said, we've got this infant formula, what are we going to do with it? And so that was routinely used for hundreds of thousands of births with a detrimental effects. This is one picture from the Indonesia Earthquake that went viral around the world. This baby was pulled out of the wreckage. Unfortunately, its mother died, but a policewoman saw it and actually started to breastfeeding. I'm actually very keen on opera, and what surprised me during a trip to Germany was that someone has written an opera about earthquakes, which is an unusual topic, and the centerpiece of this opera is actually an earthquake, and there is a policewoman, obviously a copy of that previous picture, breastfeeding, in this case a plastic baby, but still breastfeeding a baby. Then I want to talk briefly about the Yogyakarta earthquake, which occurred in a fairly well-populated area of Indonesia and the island of Java. In Yogyakarta, there again was a large distribution of milk products. The aid workers simply gave out infant formula to anybody that they came across, and in this case, the UNICEF workers kept very good records of infant illnesses. And as you can see, the relative risk of developing diarrhea for those that were given formula was double the risk for those that didn't have it. So now we have a documentation of some of the effects of infant formula. So here's a summary of the three disasters. Infant formula was always made available in quantity, except in Papua New Guinea, but it was made available without any assessment of need and in quantities far excess of what could be required. In PNG, there's not much formula because it's actually banned, but the area was too remote and it was not worth it for any publicity by any of the multinational companies. In Indonesia, the inappropriate use of formula led to increases of diarrheal disease and, of course, risks to infants. In China, the increased availability of formula resulted in good advertising, lots of advertising for multinational companies. Plenty of samples were distributed around, hospital storerooms were full of it, and so we had increased prelactal feeds, and unfortunately the decline in exclusive breastfeeding has continued since that time. We also were able to document an increase in hospital admissions from diarrhea and lower respiratory tract infections of those infants who receive infant formula. In some ways, there was good outcome in that infant formula was made available to infants without mothers, but then we've got the bad results which predominated. The recent United Nations report on food security and nutrition, which came out a week or two ago, highlights the devastating effect that COVID-19 is going to have on food supplies. No longer were we on track to achieve sustainable development guideline number 2, which is about food and hunger. And we'll still estimate there'll be 140 million hungry people by 2030. The other thing in this report is the statement that the global poverty line is $1.90 US per day, which isn't very much. But to eat a healthy diet, people need at least 3 or 4 times this. And that's something that we've got to work for. So have we learned any lessons over the years? No. Recently, IPFAN, the Baby Food Network, has posted this message online.
12 minutes, 2 minutes or so.
Large global corporations are taking advantage of COVID-19 and promoting their formula, despite the fact that WHO says there's no reason for mothers not to breastfeed during COVID-19. So we've got a number of ethical dilemmas. Basically, if companies are going to donate infant formula to disasters, they should do so in plain packaging. They should not use any advertising, and they should only distribute what's needed. Now, breastfeeding is best and must be preserved even during disasters. And if you would like a copy of this rather rushed talk, please send me an email and I'll send you a copy and any papers. Thank you very much.
Time. So anyway, we haven't received any major questions that have come through from the audience. We will have to terminate this session now. Thank you so much for taking part in this presentation, especially from as far away as from Australia. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your presence.